The wind that swept down from the obsidian peaks carried a chill that had nothing to do with the coming night. It was a coldness of stone and solitude, of ancient secrets locked in the jagged volcanic rock that clawed at the sky. Below, in the dusty plains where the crowds thronged and the noise of life was a constant hum, the air was warm, filled with the scent of bread and olives. But up here, the world was different. It was a place of silence, broken only by the mournful cry of that high-altitude wind. For 6 days, a palpable tension had been coiling around Jesus and his followers. It wasn't a feeling of fear, but of anticipation, a sense that the gears of destiny were beginning to turn with an audible groan. Jesus had been quieter than usual. His eyes, which so often danced with warmth and compassion, now held a distant, profound gravity, as if he were looking at two worlds at once, the one before him and another, invisible and immense, that was drawing ever closer. His disciples felt the shift. They spoke in hushed tones, their boisterous arguments and easy laughter replaced by a watchful reverence. They knew he was preparing for Jerusalem, the city of prophets and kings, the city that so often became their tomb. He had spoken of it plainly, of betrayal, of suffering, of death. The words had landed among them like stones, shattering their dreams of an earthly kingdom with a glorious throne. On the evening of the 6th day, as the sun began to paint the western clouds in hues of fire and blood, Jesus rose from his quiet contemplation, the camp stilled. Every eye was on him. He scanned the faces of his 12 chosen men, his gaze lingering on each for a heartbeat. Then, his voice, calm but carrying an undeniable authority that cut through the wind, spoke 3 names. Simon, Caleb, Asher, come with me. A ripple of surprise went through the group. Not all of them, just 3. Simon, the rugged fisherman, whose faith was as solid as the rock his new name implied, yet whose heart was often a tempest of impulse and passion, felt a jolt of both pride and apprehension. Caleb, the elder of the 2 brothers, stoic and thoughtful, whose quiet strength was a constant anchor for the others, gave a solemn nod, his mind already turning over the possibilities. And Asher, Caleb's younger brother, the one they called the Beloved, whose soul was that of a poet, and whose gaze saw the world in shades of wonder and sorrow, felt his heart quicken. Why them? Why this separation? The other 9 disciples watched with a mixture of disappointment and awe as the chosen 3 gathered their cloaks. There was no explanation given, no reason offered. There was only the quiet command and the immediate, unquestioning obedience. The journey began. They left the flickering firelight of the camp and the questioning eyes of their brothers, turning their faces toward the colossal silhouette of Mount Cinder, the tallest and most forbidding of the obsidian peaks. The locals spoke of the mountain in whispers, a place where the sky and the underworld met, where strange lights were sometimes seen and the air itself felt thin, stretched between realms. Shepherds refused to graze their flocks on its higher slopes, claiming the silence there was too heavy, too full of listening ears. The path was less a trail and more a scar etched into the mountain's flank, a treacherous stairway of loose scree and sharp-edged rock. The initial ascent was through a forest of gnarled, skeletal trees, their branches twisted by centuries of wind into agonizing shapes. As they climbed, the sounds of the world below, the distant bleating of sheep, the murmur of the camp faded into nothingness. They were enveloped by the mountain's profound and intimidating silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their sandals on the gravel, their own labored breathing, and the ever-present sighing of the wind. An hour into the climb, as they paused on a narrow ledge overlooking a chasm of pure darkness, Jesus turned to them. The last light of dusk caught the side of his face, casting his features in deep shadow. "Truly, I tell you," he said, his voice quiet yet seeming to echo in the vast emptiness, "some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God arrive with power." The words hung in the cold, thin air. Simon frowned, his mind racing. The kingdom here? He imagined an army, a legion of angels descending upon the peak to crown their master. Caleb looked at Jesus, his expression unreadable, trying to decipher the prophecy with logic and reason. Was it a parable? A metaphor for some inner truth? Asher simply felt a shiver trace its way down his spine. He didn't try to understand. He felt the weight of the words, the sheer earth-shattering power contained within them. Taste death, see the kingdom. It was a promise and a mystery, and it filled him with a terror that was indistinguishable from awe. They did not speak of it again. They simply continued their climb, the master's words now the unspoken purpose of their journey. The air grew colder, biting at their exposed skin. The physical exertion was immense, their muscles burning, their lungs aching for the thicker air of the plains. But a different energy propelled them forward, a sense of being drawn, pulled by an invisible thread towards the mountain's summit. They were leaving the familiar world behind, not just physically but spiritually. They were ascending towards a revelation, and the climb itself was the price of admission. Finally, as the first stars began to pierce the velvet blackness of the sky, they reached a wide, flat plateau just below the true summit. It was a desolate place, a circle of bare rocks surrounded by the jagged teeth of the peaks. The wind howled here, a wild and lonely sound. From this vantage point, the world they knew had dissolved into a sea of shadow. They were utterly alone, suspended between heaven and earth. Jesus gestured for them to sit and rest. He himself walked a short distance away, turning his face toward the star-dusted heavens, and began to pray. Simon, Caleb, and Asher huddled together, pulling their cloaks tight against the cold, their eyes fixed on the solitary figure of their master. The exhaustion of the climb settled upon them, a heavy, leaden weight, but sleep was impossible. The air was charged, electric with an unspoken promise. They were on the threshold of something unimaginable. They were about to see what the kingdom of God looked like. And then, as the last sliver of the sun bled away behind the western crags, the change began. It began not with a flash, but with a whisper of light. At first, it was so faint that Asher thought his tired eyes were playing tricks on him, a strange reflection of starlight on the master's simple homespun robe. But then Caleb stiffened beside him, and he heard Simon's sharp intake of breath. It was real. A soft, pearlescent glow was beginning to emanate from the center of Jesus' being, a light that seemed to be born from within his very bones. As he prayed, this nascent luminescence seeped outward, not illuminating his clothes but fundamentally changing them. The rough, earthy fabric began to lose its texture, its color draining away to be replaced by a white so pure and absolute it seemed to hum with life. It was not the white of bleached wool or fresh snow. It was the white of raw lightning, of a star's core, a brilliance that no earthly launderer could ever hope to achieve. The three men scrambled backward, their hands instinctively coming up to shield their eyes as the intensity grew. The phenomenon was accelerating. The light, having saturated his garments, now bloomed from his skin. It poured from his hands and face, not as a reflection, but as an impossibly bright source. His features, usually so familiar, the lines of kindness around his eyes, the gentle curve of his mouth began to dissolve into a radiant effulgence. His face shone, but it was not the harsh, blinding glare of the midday sun. It was the creative light of the first dawn, a light that felt both ancient and new, a light that seemed to be the very substance of life itself. The mountain, which had been a creature of shadow and cold wind, reacted to the presence of this impossible light. The relentless, howling wind faltered, then died completely. The profound silence that replaced it was heavier, deeper than before, silence of absolute reverence. The biting cold that had seeped into their marrow receded, replaced by a gentle, inexplicable warmth that radiated from the transfigured Christ. Even the dark volcanic rock beneath their feet seemed to shimmer, the obsidian ground catching the divine light and reflecting it in a million microscopic points, as if the very stones were awakening to worship their Creator. The desolate plateau was no longer a place of emptiness, but a holy sanctuary, a temple not made with hands. The three disciples were undone. This was beyond any miracle they had witnessed. They had seen him heal the sick, command the storms and raise the dead. Those were acts of power upon the world. This was an unveiling of the power within him, a glimpse into the fundamental nature of his being. Simon, the man of action and impulse, was paralyzed. His mind, which always raced to categorize and react, was utterly short-circuited. He saw not just a man, but raw, uncontainable power. He saw the authority that could shatter empires and remake the world. This was the king he had secretly longed for, not a humble teacher, but a celestial sovereign whose glory could burn the legions of Rome to ash. The sight filled him with a terror so profound it felt like exhilaration, and he fell to his knees, not in gentle worship, but in primal submission to an overwhelming force. Caleb, the thinker, the pragmatist, found his world breaking apart. His rational mind fought desperately for an explanation, a strange, atmospheric phenomenon. a trick of the moonlight on ice crystals in the air. But there was no moon, and the warmth they felt defied all logic. Every law of nature, he understood, screamed that this was impossible. The light had no source, yet it was brighter than the sun. The silence was absolute, yet it seemed to roar in his ears. He was witnessing a truth that his intellect could not contain, and the cognitive dissonance was a physical agony. He felt his carefully constructed understanding of reality crumble into dust, and in its place was only one terrifying, liberating conclusion. They were in the presence of God. But it was Asher, the poet, the beloved, who saw deepest. While his brothers were blinded by the power, or shattered by the impossibility, Asher's soul resonated with the light. He forced himself to look past the blinding corona, to peer into the heart of the living star that was his master. And in that inferno of glory, he saw not just power, but a love so vast it was heartbreaking. He saw the grace that had touched the leper, the compassion that had wept for a dead friend, the patience that had endured their own foolishness, all magnified to an infinite degree, burning at the heart of this divine fire. This was not a power display to intimidate them. It was an act of intimate revelation, a moment of profound vulnerability where Jesus was allowing them to see the truth he carried within him every single day. The words Asher would one day write were being forged in his soul at that very moment. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The light reached a crescendo, a silent, sustained explosion of pure being. It was too much for mortal eyes, too much for mortal hearts. The three disciples were no longer just on their knees. They were prostrate, faces pressed against the cold, shimmering rock, shielding themselves from a holiness so complete it was physically painful. They were fishermen, simple men of dust and sweat, and they were beholding the unveiled glory of the eternal. The chasm between the created and the Creator was laid bare, and the sheer weight of it was crushing them. Just as they felt their senses would be extinguished by the overwhelming spectacle, the very fabric of the moment shifted again. The light, which had been an expanding, all-encompassing flood, began to coalesce. It pulsed, and within its brilliant heart the outlines of two other forms began to resolve, as if being sculpted from the divine radiance itself. They were not angels with wings of fire, nor were they indistinct, ghostly apparitions. They were men, solid, real. They materialized out of the light, standing now on either side of the glorified Christ, their own forms shining with a reflected heavenly luster. The disciples, risking a glance from their prostrate position, gasped in unison. They had never seen these men before, yet with a certainty that defied logic and transcended history, they knew exactly who they were. Time itself seemed to buckle on that mountaintop. The neat, linear progression of history, past, present, future collapsed into a single, transcendent moment. For standing there, bathed in the unearthly glow of the transfigured Christ, were two figures who should have been separated by centuries of dust and memory. They were impossible presences, specters of legend made flesh, and yet their reality was as undeniable as the solid rock beneath the disciples' trembling hands. To the right of Jesus stood a man whose face was etched with the gravity of one who had spoken with God as a friend. His beard was long and streaked with silver. His eyes held the deep, weary wisdom of a leader who had carried the burdens of a stubborn nation on his shoulders for 40 years. He wore simple robes, but they shimmered with a borrowed light, and in his posture was the unyielding authority of the lawgiver. His presence felt as ancient and foundational as the commandments he had brought down from another fiery mountain. It was Moses, the liberator, the man whose body was buried by God himself in a secret grave, his final resting place unknown to any mortal. Yet here he was, not as a resurrected corpse, but as a living, vibrant being, his consciousness intact, his spirit burning brightly in the presence of the one his laws had foretold. To the left of Jesus stood another, a figure of wild, untamed energy. His hair and beard were a tempest of dark fire, and his eyes blazed with the passionate intensity of a man who had called down fire from the heavens. His frame was lean and powerful like a desert predator, and he seemed to crackle with a righteous fury that had once challenged corrupt kings and shamed a nation of idolaters. It was Elijah, the Tishbite, the prophet who had never tasted death, who had been swept up into the heavens in a chariot of fire and a whirlwind, leaving behind only a fallen mantle and a legacy of divine power. He was the exception to the rule of mortality, a living testament to God's ability to transcend the final enemy. The disciples, peering through their fingers, were struck by a staggering realization. This was not a symbolic vision. It was not a dream or an allegory conjured in their minds. This was a physical, tangible meeting. The air vibrated with the presence of these three titans of history. The veil between the realm of the living and the realm of the so-called dead had been torn asunder, and the summit of Mount Cinder had become a nexus point, a place where the eternal intruded upon the temporal. Simon's mind reeled with the theological paradox. Moses is dead. The scriptures are clear. Elijah never died. How can they stand together? The very laws of existence as he understood them were being rewritten before his eyes. It was a visual confirmation of a truth they had only grasped in part, that the soul is not extinguished by the grave. For Moses, death had not been an end but a transition, a passage into a continued conscious existence in the presence of God. For Elijah, the absence of death meant he was preserved, held in readiness for a purpose beyond his earthly ministry. And now that purpose was revealed. They were not here merely as honored guests. They were here as witnesses, as archetypes. Moses, the one who died, represented the multitude of the faithful who sleep in the Lord, awaiting the final resurrection. Elijah, the one who was taken, represented those who would be alive at the Lord's return, transformed in the twinkling of an eye. Together, they embodied the complete company of the redeemed, the two streams of humanity's faithful journey, those who pass through the waters of death, and those who are lifted above them, converging at the feet of the Messiah. Asher felt a profound sense of connection, a sudden intuitive understanding of the grand sweeping narrative of salvation. It was as if he was seeing the sacred scrolls unrolled before him, not as ink on parchment, but as a living tableau. Moses, who had led the first exodus from bondage in Egypt, Elijah, who had called for a spiritual exodus from the bondage of apostasy, and now Jesus, the subject of their intense and focused conversation. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered across 1,500 years of history, were snapping into place on this lonely mountaintop, and they were talking. This was perhaps the most astonishing detail of all. They were not silent, reverent statues. Their voices were low, a resonant murmur that the disciples could not quite decipher. Yet the cadence was one of urgent, serious discussion. These were not ghosts reminiscing about the past. They were active participants in a divine council, fully aware, fully engaged, discussing the pivotal moment in cosmic history that was about to unfold. Caleb, ever the observer, strained to understand. What could they possibly be discussing? The glory of the coming kingdom, the defeat of their enemies, the restoration of all things. It was a conversation between the law, the prophets, and the fulfillment of both. It was a meeting of the past and the future in the crucible of the present. The presence of these two specific men answered a question that had hung over Israel for centuries. Not Abraham, the father of the faith. Not David, the king after God's own heart. It had to be Moses and Elijah. Why? Because they represented the two great pillars of divine revelation upon which all of Jewish life was built, the law and the prophets. Their appearance was a living, breathing endorsement. The entirety of the Old Covenant, in the persons of its two most iconic representatives, was here to bear witness, to honor, and ultimately to hand over its authority to the Son. Moses gave the law that revealed sin. Elijah was the prophet who called for repentance from it. Now, both stood before the one who would be the ultimate solution to sin, the Lamb of God. The disciples watched, mesmerized, as the three figures interacted. There was no sense of rivalry or hierarchy between the two visitors. Their entire focus, their complete deference, was on the central, brilliantly shining figure of Jesus. They spoke to him, gestured toward him, their expressions a mixture of awe and solemn agreement. They were counselors, yes, but they were also subjects before their king. They, the mighty mouthpieces of God from ages past, were now listening to the Word made flesh. And the subject of their conversation was not what the disciples expected. As the wind momentarily stilled and a fragment of their dialogue drifted down, it was a word that struck their hearts with confusion and a dawning dread. It was not a word of victory or glory or power. They were speaking of Jerusalem. They were speaking of his departure. They were speaking of his death. The word, when it finally reached them, was not carried on the wind but seemed to materialize directly in their minds, a sudden chilling whisper that cut through the awe. It was the Greek word exodos, departure, a going out. The disciples, even in their state of sublime terror, recognized the term. But in this context, on this holy mountain, spoken between these three figures of immense power, the word was saturated with a weight that went far beyond its simple definition. It was a key, unlocking a chamber of understanding so profound and terrible that their minds recoiled from it. They were talking about his death. In the midst of this breathtaking revelation of glory, in this glimpse of the kingdom's power, the topic of conversation was not conquest, but sacrifice. Not a throne, but a cross. Not coronation, but execution. The paradox was a physical blow. Why summon the greatest lawgiver and the fiercest prophet from across the veil of time and eternity to discuss failure? To plan for a defeat in Jerusalem, the very city they expected him to liberate. Simon's heart, which had soared with visions of a conquering king, plummeted. The glorious light suddenly seemed less a promise of imminent victory and more a poignant, tragic farewell. Was this brilliance the last flash of a dying flame? He felt a surge of his old, protective impulsiveness. He wanted to shout, to rush forward and tell them they were wrong, to shield his master from this morbid, unthinkable destiny. But he was pinned to the ground by a power he could not defy, a silent spectator to a conversation that was sealing his master's doom. Caleb, however, began to connect the threads. Exodus. The word was not chosen by chance. It was a deliberate echo, a theological thunderclap that reverberated all the way back to the foundational story of their people. Moses, the man standing right there, had overseen the first and greatest exodus, leading their ancestors out of the crushing slavery of Egypt. It was a story of liberation, of passing through the waters of judgment into the promise of a new land. It was the central act of God's saving power in their history. Now, on this mountain, a new exodus was being discussed. Caleb's mind raced, forging the connections. This was not about a geographical departure from Jerusalem. It was about a spiritual departure from a bondage far greater than that of Egypt. Jesus was about to lead a new, ultimate exodus, not for one nation, but for all of humanity. He would lead them out of the slavery of sin and the tyranny of death. But the path of this new liberator would be radically different. The first Moses had lifted his staff to part the sea. This new Moses, Jesus, would be lifted on a cross. The first Exodus was sealed with the blood of lambs on doorposts. This new Exodus would be sealed with the blood of the Lamb of God himself. The first journey led to a promised land of milk and honey. This new journey would open the way to a promised kingdom, an eternal inheritance. The victory would not be won by plagues and chariots, but through suffering and surrender. The enemy was not a human pharaoh, but the ancient spiritual powers of darkness. Asher, listening with his soul, felt the crushing, beautiful sorrow of the plan. He understood. Moses and Elijah were not there to dissuade Jesus. They were there to strengthen him. They, who knew the bitterness of a disobedient people and the loneliness of the prophetic calling, were the only ones who could truly comprehend the weight of the burden Jesus was about to bear. Moses had faced the rebellion of Israel in the desert. Elijah had fled from the murderous Queen Jezebel, despairing in his solitude. They knew the pain of being God's messenger to a world that rejected the message. They were here as fellow soldiers, as witnesses from eternity, affirming the necessity and the cosmic significance of the sacrifice. They were reminding him, even in this moment of unveiled glory, of the dark path he had to walk to secure the freedom of all. The conversation was a confirmation that the cross was not a tragic accident, not a plan gone wrong. It was the plan. It was the predetermined counsel of God, spoken of in the eternal realms, now being discussed on this temporal peak. This was the strategy session for the day of human history. The disciples were being shown two things simultaneously. They were seeing the ultimate glory of Christ, the final destination, but they were also being made to overhear the cost of the journey. The glory and the suffering were inextricably linked. You could not have one without the other. This was the lesson they needed to learn, the truth they had to internalize before the darkness fell in Jerusalem. They needed to know that the man they would see arrested, scourged, and crucified was the same man they now saw radiating a light that outshone the sun. The Transfiguration was the anchor for their faith, a memory that would have to sustain them through the coming storm when all other hope seemed lost. While the men below grappled with this devastating new understanding, the conversation above continued. The three figures spoke with a solemn intimacy, their shared purpose binding them together. The light around Jesus seemed to soften, the overwhelming power, giving way to an aura of profound, resolute love. He was the lamb being prepared for the slaughter, and the heavens themselves had sent emissaries to attend to him. They were discussing the logistics of redemption, the path of the great exodus that would begin in the Garden of Gethsemane and end at an empty tomb. The scene was almost too much to bear the celestial glory, the grim subject matter, the convergence of history. The disciples felt as though their very spirits were being stretched to the breaking point. This mountain was a stage where the greatest drama of the cosmos was being rehearsed, and they were the sole unworthy audience. They had ascended the mountain seeking a revelation of power, and they had found it. But intertwined with it was a revelation of sacrifice so complete, so absolute, that it threatened to break their hearts. And just as they thought the moment could hold no more wonder or terror, a new player entered the scene, one whose presence would eclipse all that had come before. The weight of the moment, the sheer emotional and spiritual pressure, finally became too much for Simon. His mind, unable to reconcile the magnificent glory with the terrifying talk of death, defaulted to its most basic instinct: to do something, to act, to impose order on the incomprehensible. He saw this perfect, holy moment, and his first human impulse was to possess it, to trap it, to build a monument to it lest it fade away. Struggling to his feet, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, he stumbled forward a few steps, his voice a hoarse crack in the sacred silence. "Master, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here," he stammered, his words tumbling out in a rush of awe and confusion. He gestured with a trembling hand, encompassing the radiant Christ and his two celestial visitors. "If you wish, let us make 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." The suggestion was born of pure reverence, yet it was a profound miscalculation. In his eagerness to honor the vision, Simon inadvertently tried to domesticate it. He sought to put the eternal on the same level as the historical. 3 shelters. As if the Son of God, the lawgiver, and the prophet were 3 venerable colleagues at a conference, each deserving of their own booth. He attempted to equate the source of the light with those who had merely reflected it. He was trying to freeze a moment that was meant to be a signpost, not a destination. He wanted to stay on the mountain of glory, to build a permanent camp and live forever in the light, avoiding the dreadful descent back into the valley where the talk of an exodus in Jerusalem awaited. Caleb winced at his friend's outburst, recognizing the well-intentioned but misguided folly. Asher simply felt a pang of sorrow, seeing how even in the face of divinity, the human heart seeks to control and contain what it should simply worship. Jesus did not have to answer. Before the last of Simon's words had finished echoing in the thin air, the very atmosphere around them changed. The gentle warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden electric chill. The light from Jesus, Moses, and Elijah did not dim, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a greater, more imposing presence. From the star-dusted, empty heavens above, a cloud began to form. It did not drift in on the wind. It materialized, descending with a slow, deliberate majesty. It was not a dark and stormy thunderhead, nor was it a wisp of benign vapor. It was a cloud of pure, luminous glory, a swirling vortex of incandescent mist that seemed both to hide and to reveal an unbearable presence within it. It was the Shekinah, the ancient cloud of God's own glory that had once guided the Israelites through the desert, the same cloud that had descended upon the tabernacle with such terrifying holiness that not even Moses could enter. The cloud enveloped the entire summit, swallowing the 3 divine figures and the 3 terrified disciples in its radiant fog. The light was now all-encompassing, a soft white blindness that erased all shapes and shadows. They could see nothing, yet they felt seen. They were inside the very presence of the Almighty, and the raw, unmediated holiness of it was a terrifying, crushing weight. Then came the voice. It was not a sound that struck the ears, but one that resonated in the very atoms of their being. It was not male or female, not old or young. It was a voice like the sound of 1,000 waterfalls, like the grinding of tectonic plates, like the harmonious chime of 1 billion stars all at once. It was a voice of absolute authority, of primordial power, a voice that had spoken galaxies into existence. The sound threw the disciples flat on their faces, pressing them into the rock with an invisible force, every ounce of strength draining from their bodies. This was the terror that had made prophets tremble and mountains smoke, and the voice spoke. Its words not a condemnation of Simon's foolishness, but a declaration of ultimate reality, a divine correction that reordered their entire universe. "This is my Son, the Beloved, in whom I am well pleased." The declaration was a thunderclap of love and authority. It was a direct, possessive and proud affirmation. My Son, not a prophet, not a lawgiver, not a messenger. Son. The distinction was absolute. The voice separated Jesus from Moses and Elijah with an infinite, unbridgeable chasm. They were servants, he was the heir. The voice then delivered its singular, eternal command, a directive aimed not just at the three men on the mountain, but at all of humanity for all time. Listen to him. The command was devastating in its simplicity. Listen to him, not to the law of Moses, for he is the fulfillment of the law, not to the pronouncements of Elijah, for he is the one the prophets spoke of. All other voices, all other authorities, all other traditions and interpretations must now fall silent before the living word. The era of types and shadows was over. The era of substance and reality had come. The Father himself had stripped away all other distractions and pointed to the single authoritative source of truth, his Son. The moment the last syllable of the command faded, the pressure lifted. The overwhelming sense of presence receded. The luminous cloud did not drift away. It simply dissolved back into the nothingness from which it had come. The silence that returned was different, no longer reverent, but empty. Slowly, shakily, the three disciples dared to lift their heads. The celestial light was gone. The two visitors from ages past had vanished. The mountaintop was once again a place of cold stone and deep shadow, illuminated only by the distant, indifferent light of the stars. And standing before them, his clothes once again the simple, rough fabric of a Galilean teacher, his face holding the familiar lines of kindness and weariness, was Jesus. He was alone. The lawgiver was gone. The prophet was gone. The glory was veiled once more. The Father's voice was silent. Everything had been stripped away, and only the Son remained. That was the point. That was the entire breathtaking message of the mountain. After all the history, all the glory, all the heavenly testimony, what remained for them to follow into the valley of the shadow was simply Jesus. The silence that followed the voice was more profound than any sound they had ever heard. It was the silence of a world remade, of a universe reordered around a new center. For a long time, none of them moved. They remained pressed against the cold, hard reality of the rock, their faces buried in the crooks of their arms, as if afraid that to look up would be to invite that terrifying glory to return. The echo of the Father's voice still vibrated in their bones, a resonance that had permanently altered their perception of reality. They were men who had heard the architect of the cosmos speak. The memory was seared into them, a brand of holy terror and sublime truth. A gentle touch on Simon's shoulder made him flinch violently. He looked up with wide, fearful eyes. It was Jesus. He had come to them, kneeling in the dust and shadows, his face no longer a blazing sun but a vessel of infinite tenderness. The divine power was veiled again, replaced by a human compassion so immediate and gentle it was almost as staggering as the glory had been. "Get up," Jesus said, his voice soft, steadying. "Do not be afraid." He spoke the words to each of them, his hand moving from Simon to Caleb, then to Asher, his touch a current of peace that flowed into their trembling limbs, quieting the frantic pounding of their hearts. The command was simple, but it carried the same authority as the voice from the cloud. It was a command to return from the brink of spiritual annihilation, to return to themselves, to return to the world of the living. Fear had no place here, not now. The revelation was not meant to destroy them, but to remake them. Slowly, hesitantly, like men waking from a dream too vast for the mind to hold, they raised their heads and looked around. The mountaintop was just a mountaintop again. The wind, no longer held in abeyance, began to stir, whispering through the jagged peaks with its old mournful tune. The stars were just stars, cold and distant. And Jesus was just Jesus, their rabbi, their friend, their master. The magnificent, terrifying tableau was gone. Moses, Elijah, the brilliant light, the glorious cloudal had vanished as if they had never been. Only Jesus remained. He stood, and they followed suit, their bodies stiff and sore, their minds reeling. The descent began in that same heavy silence. The path that had seemed a stairway to heaven on the way up now felt like a long, winding fall back to earth. Each step took them further from the sacred space, further from the moment when eternity had torn through time. As they navigated the treacherous, moon-shadowed trail, Jesus spoke again, his voice low and serious. "Tell no one what you have seen," he commanded. "Not a word. Keep the vision to yourselves until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The order was another paradox, another layer of mystery. Why grant them such an earth-shattering revelation only to command their silence? Why show them the very glory of the kingdom and then forbid them from proclaiming it? Simon, walking behind Jesus, opened his mouth to ask, then closed it. For once, his impulsive tongue was checked. He was beginning to understand. To speak of this now without the context of what was to come would be to tell only half the story. The world was hungry for a Messiah of power and light, a king who could banish their enemies with a word. If they told of the transfigured Christ, of the mountain that shone like the sun, they would ignite a firestorm of political hope. The people would try to make him king by force for all the wrong reasons. They would see the glory but miss the purpose. They would clamor for the crown but reject the cross. The story of the Transfiguration was incomplete without the story of the resurrection. The glory they had witnessed on the mountain was the answer to the suffering they would witness on the hill of Golgotha. One could not be understood without the other. The secret had to be kept, locked away in their hearts like a sacred, burning ember. But Caleb, his analytical mind still trying to piece together the cosmic puzzle, had a more immediate question. The appearance of Elijah had stirred a deep doctrinal query. "Master," he asked, his voice careful, respectful, "the scribes and teachers of the law, they all say that Elijah must come first, before the Messiah restores all things. We have just seen him, but what does it mean?" It was the question that had plagued rabbinic scholars for generations. The prophecy in Malachi was clear. Elijah would return as a forerunner to the great and terrible day of the Lord. His appearance on the mountain seemed to be a direct fulfillment. Yet here they were, descending into a world that was clearly not yet restored. Jesus paused on the path, turning to face them in the gloom. His expression was patient, as if he had been waiting for this very question. "He is right in what he says," Jesus affirmed, his voice resonating with ancient truth. "Elijah does come first, to prepare the way and restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come." He let the words sink in, watching their confused faces. "He has already come," Jesus repeated, his voice filled with a profound sadness, and they did not recognize him. Instead, they did to him whatever they pleased. In the same way, the Son of Man is also going to suffer at their hands. A sudden, dawning horror crossed the disciples' faces. Caleb's eyes widened as the connection was forged in his mind. The wild prophet in the desert, clad in camel's hair, eating locusts and wild honey. The fiery preacher who had confronted King Herod with his sin. The man whose voice had cried out in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." The man who had just been beheaded in a palace dungeon to satisfy the whim of a dancing girl. "John," Asher whispered the name, his heart aching. "You mean John the Baptist?" Jesus gave a slow, solemn nod. The spirit and power of Elijah had rested upon John. He was the forerunner, the restorer, the voice. But his generation, blind and deaf to the movements of God, had rejected him. They had silenced the prophet, just as their ancestors had silenced the prophets before him. And in that rejection of the forerunner, Jesus showed them the blueprint for his own rejection. The fate of the messenger foretold the fate of the master. The rest of the descent was made in a new kind of silence. It was no longer the silence of awe, but the silence of understanding. The pieces were fitting together into a beautiful, terrible mosaic. The glory of the mountain, the conversation about the Exodus, the command to silence, the fate of John the Baptist. It all pointed to one inescapable destination, a cross in Jerusalem. They had been taken to the summit to see the end of the story, so that they might have the strength to endure the middle. They were descending from the mountain of revelation, not to a kingdom but to a conflict. The vision was not over, it had just begun, and they were now its secret keepers, guardians of a truth too glorious and too painful for the world to yet receive. The memory of the light was now a phantom limb, an ache in their spiritual senses. As they descended further into the mundane world, the three disciples struggled to hold on to the reality of what they had seen, the glorified body of Jesus. It was a concept so alien, so far beyond human experience, that their minds kept trying to shrink it down, to file it away as a dream or a metaphor. But the searing imprint on their souls was undeniable. It was a manifestation that answered questions they hadn't even known how to ask. For their entire lives, they had walked with Jesus in his humanity. They had seen him weary from a long journey, his face etched with fatigue. They had watched him sleep, his breathing as regular and vulnerable as any other man's. They had shared meals with him, seen him hunger, seen him thirst. They had seen him weep with gut-wrenching grief at the tomb of his friend Lazarus. He was their rabbi, their teacher, their friend, grounded in the same gritty, dusty reality as they were. His divinity was a matter of faith, something they perceived through his words and his miracles, but his humanity was what they touched and saw every day. On the mountain, that paradigm had been inverted. The veil of his flesh, the humble clay vessel that housed an infinite spirit, had for a few breathtaking moments become translucent. It was not that his humanity was erased. Rather, it was saturated and overwhelmed by the divine glory that was his true native state. The light that shone from him was the light of the eternal Word, the same creative force that had spoken at the dawn of time, "Let there be light." They had witnessed for the first time the splendor of the glorified body, the form that existence takes when it is perfected and united with God. Asher, his mind a whirlwind of poetry and revelation, found himself thinking of the descriptions in the Holy Scrolls, the prophet Daniel, falling down as if dead before a celestial being whose face was like lightning. The prophet Ezekiel, overwhelmed by the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Asher now understood that terror. He had been a first-hand witness to it. The glorified body was not just beautiful, it was terrifyingly holy. It was a state of being so pure that it exposed every flaw, every shadow, every imperfection in the mortal beholder. To stand before it was to be judged not by a word but by a presence. This was the body of the resurrection, shown to them before the crucifixion. It was a preview of the end, a promise that the grave would not be the final chapter. The body that would be broken, pierced, and laid in a cold stone tomb was the same body that contained this inexhaustible fountain of light. The Transfiguration was a divine seal, a heavenly guarantee that said, "The lamb will be slain, but the lion already reigns." Caleb, ever the logician, wrestled with the implications. The light was not reflected, like the shine on Moses' face after he had been in God's presence on Sinai. This was different. This light emanated from Jesus. It was his own. This confirmed a staggering truth. Jesus was not just a conduit for God's glory, he was the glory of God in human form. As the sacred text said, the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. The disciples had been in the presence of the archetype, the original pattern for a new humanity. And in that, Caleb saw a glimmer of a promise for themselves. He recalled the words of the prophets about a future time when the righteous would shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. What they had seen in Jesus was not just a unique phenomenon but a prototype. It was a preview of the destiny awaiting all who were redeemed. The Apostle Paul would later write that Christ would transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. On Mount Cinder, Simon, Caleb and Asher were the first to see the blueprint. Their own humble, aching bodies, subject to decay and death, held the seed of that same glorious potential, a potential that would be unlocked through the very exodus they had heard discussed. The uniqueness of the moment was also defined by its timing. Jesus had not yet suffered. This was a glory that existed before the cross. It was an invasion of the future into the present, a temporal paradox orchestrated by the Lord of Time itself. It was a declaration that death would have no real power over him. It was an advance viewing of the victory, shown to the generals before the battle had even begun. This glorified body was also the body of the judge. The same Jesus who had appeared in resplendent glory on the mountain would one day return on the clouds, as the scriptures promised, to judge the nations. The disciples had seen a glimpse of the awesome majesty of the coming king, and the memory instilled in them a holy fear. The glory was not just comforting, it was also sobering. This is why, Caleb realized, Moses and Elijah had to disappear. They were men of God, giants of the faith, and they shone with a reflected heavenly light. But their light paled into insignificance like candles in the face of the sun before the inherent, self-generating glory of the sun. Their presence served to give testimony, but once the Father's voice had spoken, their role was complete. The law and the prophets had pointed the way, but now they had to recede, leaving the focus solely on Christ. The glory of the Old Covenant, with its rituals and symbols, was giving way to the direct personal glory of the New Covenant, revealed not in thunder and fire on a mountain, but in the face of the sun. And yet, Jesus did not remain transfigured. He had allowed the veil to be lifted for a moment, but then he had willingly lowered it again. He returned to his common form, not because his glory had diminished, but because his mission was not yet complete. He had shown them the destination, but he still had to walk the path. The mountain was the promise, the valley was the process, and the next step in that process was the cross. The glory was real, but the cross was necessary. This was the profound lesson sinking into their hearts as they made their way down the dark, winding path. Glory is not a substitute for suffering. It is its ultimate reward. They could not live on the mountaintop. They had to descend, to face the confusion, the betrayal, and the pain that lay ahead, fortified by the secret knowledge of the glory that awaited on the other side. But as they neared the base of the mountain, re-entering the world of men, they were about to be confronted with a stark reminder of just how much this broken world needed the power of the King they had just glimpsed. The transition was jarring, a spiritual whiplash that left them disoriented. One moment they were descending from a realm of celestial order and divine pronouncements, their minds still echoing with the voice of God. The next, they were plunged back into the raw, messy chaos of human desperation. As they reached the foothills of Mount Cinder, the profound silence of the heights was shattered by a cacophony of frantic, agitated voices. A large crowd had gathered around the 9 disciples they had left behind. The atmosphere was not one of peaceful teaching, but of heated, escalating conflict. At the center of the turmoil, the 9 disciples stood looking flustered, defensive, and utterly powerless. Their faces were a mixture of shame and frustration. They were being accosted by a group of scribes, their expressions smug and triumphant, who were mocking them in front of the crowd, pointing fingers and making grand theatrical gestures of disdain. Pushing through the outer ring of curious onlookers, Jesus, Simon, Caleb, and Asher saw the source of the commotion. A man, his face a mask of anguish and utter exhaustion, was on his knees before the 9. Beside him, his son, a boy of about 12, was writhing on the ground in the throes of a violent seizure. The boy's body was rigid, his eyes rolled back into his head, and a white foam flecked his lips. He would suddenly arch his back, a guttural, inhuman sound escaping his throat, before collapsing, only to be seized by another violent tremor. It was a horrifying spectacle of torment. The father, seeing Jesus approach, let out a cry of desperate hope. He scrambled through the dust, leaving the other disciples, and fell at Jesus' feet. Tears streamed down his face, carving clean tracks through the grime. "Master," he cried, his voice breaking, "I beg you, have mercy on my son. He is tormented by a spirit. It seizes him and suddenly he screams. It throws him into convulsions and he foams at the mouth. It throws him into the fire, into the water, trying to destroy him. It barely ever leaves him, and it has shattered him completely. Creuset." He paused, taking a ragged breath, and then cast a despairing, almost accusatory, glance back at the other disciples. "I brought him to your followers, but they could not heal him." The final words hung in the air, a public declaration of failure. The smirking scribes seized on it, their murmurs growing louder. "See, their power is nothing without their master. They are charlatans." Jesus' face, which had been serene and patient on the mountain, now filled with a deep, visceral pain. It was a sorrow that seemed to encompass the entire scene: the boy's suffering, the father's anguish, the disciples' impotence, and the scribe's cynical mockery. But his sorrow was laced with a righteous frustration, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He looked out at the crowd, at the faithless scribes, at his own powerless followers, and at the tormented generation they represented. "O unbelieving and perverse generation!" His voice rang out, silencing the crowd. It was not a shout of anger, but a cry of deep lament, the cry of a king beholding the rebellion and brokenness of his own kingdom. "How long must I stay with you? How long must I put up with you?" The question was not directed at any one person, but at the spiritual condition of the world itself. He had just descended from a place of perfect faith and divine order, only to be confronted by the stark reality of a world dominated by doubt, darkness, and demonic power. His gaze softened as he looked back down at the pleading father. The divine frustration melted away, replaced by focused, immediate compassion. "Bring the boy here to me." The father and some others rushed to lift the convulsing boy and carry him toward Jesus. As they brought him near, the demonic entity within the child recognized the presence of ultimate authority. The boy let out a piercing shriek and was thrown to the ground in a final violent spasm, rolling and writhing in the dust at Jesus' feet. The scene was a stark, brutal contrast to the mountaintop. There, Moses and Elijah, representatives of the dead and the living, had stood in glorious, deferential conversation with Jesus. Here, in the valley, a demon-possessed boy, representing a world held captive by death and darkness, lay convulsing in defiance. The mountaintop was a glimpse of the kingdom's glory. The valley was a demonstration of the kingdom's war. Jesus ignored the crowd and the scribes. He knelt beside the boy, his focus absolute. He looked at the father. "How long has this been happening to him?" "Since childhood," the father said, his voice trembling. "But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." The man's plea was heartbreaking, but it was tainted with the residue of his disappointment. "If you can." The words were a sliver of doubt, a last, desperate gamble. Jesus looked at him, his gaze intense, piercing. "If I can," he repeated, turning the man's doubt back on him. "Everything is possible for one who believes." The words struck the father like a physical blow. He stared at Jesus, his doubt and his desperation warring in his eyes. He saw the powerlessness of the nine, the mockery of the scribes, the horrifying state of his son. And he saw the calm, commanding presence of this man who spoke of belief as if it were a creative force. In that instant, something broke inside him. With a sob that seemed to tear from the depths of his soul, he cried out the most honest prayer ever uttered. "I do believe. Help my unbelief." It was a perfect confession and acknowledgement of his faith, and an honest admission of its frailty. It was enough. Jesus turned his attention to the boy. The crowd was pressing in now. Their morbid curiosity piqued. He rose to his feet and spoke to the unclean spirit with the sharp, commanding tone of a king rebuking a trespasser. "You deaf and mute spirit," he commanded, his voice cutting through the air. "I order you, come out of him, and never enter him again." A final blood-curdling scream tore from the boy's throat. His body went into a seizure so violent it seemed it would tear him apart. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, he fell limp, utterly still like a discarded doll. He was so pale and motionless that the people in the crowd began to whisper, "He's dead. The cure killed him." But Jesus knelt again. He ignored the murmurs. He reached out and took the boy's hand. The same hand that had touched the disciples in their fear on the mountain now infused life back into this broken child. Jesus gently pulled him up and the boy stood on his own feet, his eyes clear, his breathing calm. He looked around, bewildered, as if waking from a long and terrible nightmare. He was whole. The exodus from his personal torment was complete. The crowd erupted. Gasps of astonishment rippled through the onlookers, quickly turning into a roar of praise and wonder. The scribes, who moments before had been preening with smug superiority, now shrank back into the crowd, their faces pale with fury and humiliation. Their theological arguments and public mockery had dissolved into nothing before this raw, undeniable display of power. The father, weeping with a joy so profound it was painful, embraced his son, holding him tight as if to ensure he was real, that he wouldn't be snatched away again. Amidst the celebration, Jesus led his disciples away, seeking the quiet solitude of the house where they were staying. The three who had been on the mountain were quiet, processing the violent shift from celestial glory to earthly struggle, but the other 9 were in turmoil. The public joy only magnified their private shame. They followed their master into the house, their heads bowed, the sting of their failure still fresh. Once the door was closed and they were alone, the festering question could no longer be contained. It was Andrew, ever the practical one, who finally voiced the confusion that plagued them all. "Why?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Why couldn't we drive it out? We used your name. We did everything we've done before. What was different this time?" The other 8 nodded in silent agreement, their eyes fixed on Jesus, searching for an answer to their humiliating impotence. They had been given authority. They had healed the sick and cast out demons on their previous missions. But today, in the face of this particular darkness, their authority had proved to be hollow. Jesus looked at them, not with condemnation, but with a deep diagnostic sadness. He saw their confusion, their wounded pride, and the root of their failure. "Because of your little faith," he said, the words gentle but surgically precise. He let the diagnosis settle in the quiet room. It wasn't about a lack of the correct formula or a failure of technique. It was a failure of the heart, a deficiency in the very currency of the kingdom. Truly, I tell you, he continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. He wasn't speaking of Mount Cinder. He was speaking of the mountain of demonic opposition they had just faced, the mountain of human suffering, the mountain of their own doubt. He held up the image of a mustard seed, the tiniest of seeds, yet one that contained the blueprint for a great tree. He wasn't demanding a huge, heroic, unshakable faith from them. He was asking for a faith that was genuine, a faith that was alive, even if it was small. Theirs, in that moment of confrontation, had faltered. It had become reliant on past successes, a second-hand power they assumed was their own. They had faced the demon not with active present trust in God's power, but with the memory of power. And it wasn't enough. Asher, remembering the glory on the mountain, saw the connection clearly. The power that had transfigured Jesus, that had summoned prophets from eternity, was the same power available to them. But it was not a tool to be wielded. It was a current to which they had to be connected. Faith was the conductor. Doubt, fear, and pride were the insulators that broke the connection. Their failure in the valley was a direct consequence of a spiritual disconnection, a reliance on their own status as disciples rather than a desperate, moment-by-moment reliance on God. The Father, in his cry of "Help my unbelief," had shown more true, desperate faith than all 9 of them combined. Jesus then added another layer to his teaching, a crucial piece of spiritual strategy. However, he said, his voice becoming graver, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. With this, he revealed that the spiritual world is not monolithic. There are levels of darkness, hierarchies of opposition. Some spiritual battles are skirmishes. Others are sieges against fortified strongholds. The entity that had tormented the boy was one of this kind, a deeply entrenched, powerful and malevolent force. To confront such darkness, casual, second-hand faith was utterly insufficient. It required a deeper level of spiritual preparation. Prayer, in this context, was not just about asking for things. It was about deep, abiding communion with the Father, the constant alignment of one's will with God's. It was the practice of remaining connected to the source of all power. Fasting was not a hunger strike to force God's hand. It was the deliberate denial of the flesh to sharpen the spirit. It was an act of humility, a declaration of one's utter dependence on God for sustenance, both physical and spiritual. It was about subordinating the clamor of the body and the world to better hear the whisper of the divine. The 9 disciples had walked into a spiritual war zone without having done the training. They had relied on their credentials instead of their connection. Their failure was a painful but necessary lesson. The authority Jesus had given them was not a permanent possession, like a sword they could carry. It was more like a signal they had to receive, and prayer and fasting were the means by which they tuned their spirits to the correct frequency. The room was silent as the weight of his words sank in. The disciples were beginning to understand the immense gap between the glory they were called to and the spiritual discipline required to walk in it. The transfiguration on the mountain and the exorcism in the valley were 2 sides of the same coin. One revealed the ultimate source of power, the unveiled glory of the King. The other revealed the conditions for wielding that power in a broken, embattled world. A faith that, however small, is desperately and actively alive, and a life disciplined by deep, dependent communion with God. The vision of glory had to be matched by the rigor of faith. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun set and long shadows filled the room, the 2 disparate experiences of the day began to merge in the disciples' minds. The blinding glory of the mountain and the desperate darkness of the valley were not opposing events. They were a single comprehensive lesson. The transfiguration was the why, the revelation of Christ's ultimate identity and the kingdom's majestic goal. The failure at the foot of the mountain was the how, the painful illustration of how that kingdom's power must be accessed in a fallen world. For Simon, Caleb and Asher, the memory of the mountaintop now served as the ultimate context. They had been granted a glimpse behind the curtain of reality, a preview of the final act. They now knew, with a certainty that could never be erased, that the man who taught them, who would suffer, who would be subjected to the ultimate human humiliation, was in fact the eternal Son, being the beloved of the Father, the radiant center of all creation. This knowledge was not meant to make them arrogant, but to make them resilient. It was a secret reservoir of hope they were to draw upon when the world went dark. The Transfiguration was a divine answer to the deepest human questions, a response to the doubts that haunt every soul. In a world that fears death, the appearance of Moses confirmed that consciousness and identity survive the grave. In a world that clings to the temporal, the presence of Elijah showed that God's power can override the very laws of nature and mortality. In a world that questions authority, the voice of the Father thundered from heaven, ending all debate about who was in charge. The event recalibrated their entire understanding of history. The law given through Moses was not an end in itself, but a schoolmaster leading to Christ. The prophets, speaking through men like Elijah, were not disparate voices, but a unified chorus heralding his arrival. On that mountain, the Old Covenant, represented by its two greatest heroes, had formally and personally bowed to the new. The torch was passed. The shadows gave way to the substance, but the lesson of the valley was just as crucial. The descent from the heights of spiritual ecstasy was immediate and brutal, a perfect metaphor for the Christian life. One cannot live on the mountaintop of experience. Faith must be lived out in the chaotic, demon-haunted valleys of everyday existence. The glory they saw was the fuel, but the work was down below. It was in the face of a tormented child, a desperate father, and a mocking, unbelieving world. The failure of the 9 disciples was not a rebuke of their status, but a refinement of their understanding. They learned that the power of the kingdom is not a magic charm invoked by a name, but a living current that flows through a conduit of authentic, desperate faith and deep, disciplined communion. They learned that there are levels to the spiritual battle, and that to face the deepest darkness, they must be armed with more than just good intentions. They must be steeped in prayer and fortified by the self-denial of fasting, constantly attuning their spirits to the will and power of their master. As night fell completely, the house was filled with a new kind of quiet. It was the quiet of men who had been irrevocably changed. They had seen too much to ever go back to being simple fishermen. They were keepers of a sacred secret, witnesses to a glory they could not yet speak of, and students of a failure that had taught them more than any success. The Transfiguration was not an isolated miracle. It was a strategic cornerstone in God's plan. It was the moment the future invaded the present to give meaning to the suffering that lay ahead. It was a seal of divine approval on the Son's journey to the cross. It was a promise that the exodus from sin and death, though it would pass through the darkness of the grave, would culminate in a glory that outshines the sun. The disciples did not know it then, but this day would become a bedrock of their faith. Years later, Simon Peter, facing his own death, would write not of fables, but of being an eyewitness of his majesty. Asher John, in his old age, would reflect on having seen his glory. The memory of that light, that voice, that convergence of ages, would sustain them through persecution, imprisonment and martyrdom. They had gone up the mountain as followers. They came down as initiates into a deeper mystery. They understood that the King had come. The kingdom was at hand, but its path to final victory was through the heart of suffering. One day, Jesus would return not veiled, not in silence, not to offer a glimpse of glory, but to unleash it upon all creation. But until that day, the work of the kingdom would continue, not always on the glorious mountaintops, but in the dark and desperate valleys, through flawed and faithful people who, in their best moments, could look up and remember the light. The mountain was more than a memory. It was a promise waiting to be fulfilled, a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, a kingdom of light is waiting and its king reigns forever.